You should have protected her. Take these and go help her now.
The first snow in Idaho had always lied. It fell softly, almost tender, settling on pine needles and river stones as if it meant no harm. By morning, it hardened, tightening its grip on the land, stealing breath and warmth from anything unprepared to endure it. Silas Moore knew this better than most. He had lived long enough in the Lemhi backcountry to recognize the difference between beauty and mercy, and he trusted neither. That evening, he followed the river as he often did, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned to leave as little of himself behind as possible. The water ran dark beneath a skin of forming ice, whispering against the banks. He was not hunting. He rarely did once winter began. Winter was for surviving, not taking. His rifle remained slung across his back more out of habit than intent. He noticed the tracks where the river bent inward, close to the old bridge no one used anymore. They were uneven, dragging, pressed too deep into the fresh snow. Not the clean marks of a man who knew where he was going, nor the sharp, narrow lines of an animal. These were desperate tracks, the kind made by someone who had already gone too far to turn back. Silas stopped and crouched, his gloved fingers hovering just above the impression before touching it. The snow had begun to crust over. Whoever made them had passed recently. He did not often follow signs left by others. People had a way of complicating the simple rules he lived by. Still, he rose and continued, not out of curiosity, but because something in the spacing of the steps suggested exhaustion rather than purpose. He moved slowly, scanning the tree line, the riverbank, the underside of the bridge where shadows gathered early. He saw her there, half hidden beneath the span, pressed into the snow as if the earth had begun to claim her already. Frost clung to the hem of her skirt and the ends of her hair. Her coat was too thin for the season and unfamiliar in cut, likely borrowed or taken in haste. One shoe lay several feet away, abandoned when the effort to retrieve it had outweighed the will to continue. She was alive. He knew it not from movement, but from the faint disturbance of snow near her mouth, a shallow rhythm that barely touched the air. Her fingers were swollen and raw, the skin split in places. Her face was drawn tight, hollowed by hunger and cold. Beneath the layers of fabric, her body carried a weight that did not belong to the journey she had attempted. Her belly was unmistakable, rounded and heavy, an impossible burden for a woman traveling alone this far into winter. Silas did not speak. He did not kneel right away. He stood there longer than he meant to, the river murmuring below, the snow continuing its quiet fall. He had learned over years spent alone to pause before action, to measure cost before consequence. This would change things. Whatever he did next would not be undone easily. He set the thought aside. Some decisions did not ask permission. He shrugged out of his pack and removed the spare blanket he carried for emergencies he never expected to share. He wrapped it around her carefully, aware of how little warmth remained in her body. When he lifted her, she was lighter than he anticipated, her weight uneven, her breath catching briefly before settling again. He adjusted his hold, securing her as one would secure something fragile, something already broken in places unseen. The walk back toward his cabin was slow.
Snow thickened with every step, erasing his tracks almost as soon as he made them. He felt the strain in his legs, the pull in his shoulders, but he did not stop. He had carried heavier loads before, though none that felt as final as this one. The forest seemed to close in, branches bowing under fresh white, the sky lowering until it pressed against the tops of the trees.
By the time his cabin came into view, darkness had begun to settle. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. He had let the fire die earlier, expecting to return alone. Inside, the space was as he had left it, sparse and cold. He laid her down near the hearth and set about rebuilding the fire with practiced hands. As warmth crept back into the room, he removed her wet outer layers and replaced them with dry cloth, moving with deliberate care, keeping his focus narrow and steady. Her breathing remained shallow but consistent. Color returned slowly to her skin, though it did not bring with it any sign of waking. Silas sat back on his heels, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the crackle of the fire. The cabin felt smaller with another presence in it, its walls no longer empty enough to disappear into. He did not know her name. He did not know where she had come from or what had driven her into the mountains so late in the year. He did not know if she would survive the night. What he knew was simpler and heavier than all of that. He had seen her in the snow, and he had lifted her up. The storm continued outside, covering the bridge, the tracks, the place where she had fallen. By morning, there would be no sign she had ever been there at all.
His cabin stood far from trails and farther still from people. There were no fields cut into the land, no neighboring roofs visible through the trees. Only forest, stone, and wind surrounded it, pressing in from all sides, as if the world had decided this place was not meant to be found. Snow gathered along the roofline and against the walls, dulling sound, erasing edges. The woman woke on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin. The heat from the fire reached her in uneven waves, enough to remind her she was still alive, but not enough to make her forget how close she had come to losing that fact. For a long moment she did not move. Her body felt heavy, unresponsive, as though it belonged to someone else. When she finally lifted her head, the room came into focus slowly. There was nothing extra in it. One narrow bed pushed against the wall, its frame scarred from years of use. A table with 2 chairs, one of them worn unevenly on the legs. A shelf holding tools arranged with deliberate order. A rifle rested within reach, not displayed, but ready. Everything had a purpose, and nothing suggested comfort beyond necessity. She understood the place immediately. This was not a home built to receive anyone. It was a shelter designed for endurance, not welcome. At the same time, there was no sense of threat in the room, no sign that she was expected to earn her presence. The absence of intention unsettled her more than hostility would have.
Silas moved quietly, his steps measured, as if he had spent years learning how not to disturb the space around him. He did not look at her for long when he noticed she was awake. He tended to the fire, adjusted a pot, set food within reach without ceremony. He behaved as though her presence was a fact to be managed, rather than a problem to be solved. She watched him from beneath the blanket, counting movements, tracking distance. Her muscles remained tense, ready for a demand that never came. She waited for conditions to be named, for expectations to be laid out. In her experience, rescue always carried a cost. The longer none appeared, the more she feared the shape it might eventually take. Time passed in fragments. She slept and woke in cycles measured by the fire and the light at the small window. Her strength returned slowly, unevenly. She moved only when necessary, conserving what little energy she had. Every sound carried weight in the small space. The scrape of a chair leg, the creak of the door, the wind testing the walls. Food appeared at regular intervals. Water was set near her hand. Her clothes were dried and folded with care, returned without comment. The attention was impersonal but thorough, as though he were tending to a task rather than a person. That too disturbed her. Kindness without explanation left no room for defense. Silas lived as if each day were already borrowed. His movements reflected long practice, habits formed around the assumption that tomorrow was not guaranteed. Nothing in his routine suggested plans beyond survival. The cabin held no markers of time, no objects meant to last. Even the light felt temporary, as though it could be extinguished without warning. The silence between them grew dense. It filled the corners of the room, pressed against her thoughts. In it, she imagined possibilities she could not confirm. Silence left space for fear to multiply, for intentions to remain hidden. Words, even harsh ones, would have given her something solid to prepare against. This silence offered nothing to hold. Still, she remained. Each hour that passed without harm loosened her vigilance by degrees too small to notice. The fire burned, the wind moved through the trees. The cabin held, steady and indifferent. She had not been asked to stay, but she had not been told to leave. And in that narrow space between, she rested, uncertain whether she had found refuge or merely a pause before whatever came next.
When she was strong enough to walk without swaying, it became clear that her presence could not remain hidden. Footprints multiplied around the cabin, larger now, more deliberate. Smoke from the chimney carried farther in the thin winter air. Supplies had to be fetched, and even in a land as wide as Idaho, absence was noticed when it broke a pattern. The people in the scattered settlements began to see signs, and signs became questions. Questions turned into quiet conclusions. A woman with child and no husband in the mountains was not seen as misfortune. It was judged as a verdict already passed. Survival did not soften that judgment. Endurance did not excuse it. The land itself seemed more forgiving than the people who claimed it. Silas did not offer explanations. He did not correct assumptions or defend arrangements that existed only in the minds of others. He had never learned how to make himself legible to the world, and age had not taught him the value of trying. When he passed through settlements, he kept his head low, his movements efficient, his presence brief. The looks that followed him were familiar, almost expected. He carried them the same way he carried everything else, without visible reaction. The woman felt those looks settle on her skin long after they were gone. She learned how quickly a body could be reduced to a story, how easily a life became a warning. She sensed the weight of eyes even when no one stood nearby. It pressed on her back, on her belly, shaping the way she moved through space. She began to understand that whatever safety the cabin offered had boundaries that did not align with walls or distance. As days passed, she noticed the quiet markers of Silas's past. They revealed themselves not through confession, but through neglect. A child's spoon lay wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a drawer, its handle worn smooth from use. A small shirt, too faded to serve any purpose now, had been cut and repurposed as a rag. It had been washed so many times the fabric barely held together. Outside, beyond the cabin, there was a mound of earth kept clear of debris, the snow around it thinner than elsewhere, as if the ground itself resisted covering it completely. She did not ask about these things. She did not need to. Loss had a texture she recognized. It left behind objects stripped of function, but heavy with memory. It settled into habits, into silence, into the way a man avoided looking at anything that reminded him of what could not be recovered.
Gradually, she understood that Silas lived alongside a guilt that had no name. It was not tied to a single moment or decision. It existed as a constant, a pressure that shaped his days. He moved through the world as if balance were fragile, as if any misstep could tip the scale toward another absence he would have to carry. The thought shifted something in her. She had assumed she was an interruption in his life, an unexpected burden imposed by circumstance. Instead, she began to see that her arrival had not disrupted anything stable. It had simply intersected with a life already built around endurance rather than hope. He had not saved her out of kindness. He had not done it out of obligation or moral reckoning. He had seen her in the snow and recognized a moment he could not allow to repeat itself. Another body left to the cold would have added weight to something already unbearable. This understanding did not lessen her own fear, but it altered its shape. She was no longer only wary of what might be demanded of her. She became aware of what he had already lost, and how little space remained for another death. The silence between them changed, carrying not just uncertainty, but an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost of survival and the things people were willing to endure so that it did not end too soon.
When her body grew heavier and the winter pressed closer, the woman decided to leave. It was not born from cruelty or desperation, but from a growing sense that the silence surrounding her had begun to resemble an unfinished ending. The days stretched on without promise or direction, and the waiting itself felt dangerous, as if something inevitable was drawing nearer with each unspoken moment. She left before dawn, while the world still held its breath. The fire had burned low, and the cabin stood quiet behind her, unchanged by the choice she was making. Silas was already gone into the forest, following his habitual routes, unaware of the space she was creating in his absence. She carried only what she could manage, moving carefully at first, then more slowly as the path climbed. The mountains offered no allowance for intent. Snow deepened with elevation, the wind cutting sharper across exposed ground. Her breathing shortened as the effort demanded more than her body was prepared to give. Still, she continued, driven not by certainty, but by the need to reclaim something that felt like agency. Each step took her farther from the shelter she had not asked for, and closer to an outcome she could not define. The pain began without warning. It tightened low and fierce, stealing her breath and forcing her to stop. She leaned against a stand of trees, hands pressed to her belly, waiting for it to pass. It did not. The cold crept in as the pain returned in waves, closer together, more insistent. The realization settled slowly, then all at once. It was too early. Her body was not ready, and the mountain did not care. She tried to move again, but her legs failed her. The snow beneath her grew dark where she knelt, stained by effort and fear. Wind tore at her clothing, stripping warmth from her faster than she could replace it. Thoughts fragmented under the weight of pain and cold, leaving only instinct and the dull knowledge that she was alone. Silas found the trail where it broke from routine. The absence in the cabin had unsettled him, though he did not name the feeling. Outside, the signs were clear enough. Her tracks led away, uneven, shallow at first, then deeper and erratic. He followed without hesitation, the forest narrowing his vision, the air burning his lungs as he moved faster than he had in years. He found her collapsed near the pass, her body curled inward against itself, the snow marked with blood and disturbed earth. The sight stripped him of restraint. He dropped to his knees beside her, assessing what needed to be done with the precision born of necessity rather than knowledge. The mountain loomed around them, indifferent, fast. He lifted her without pause, securing her against his chest, ignoring the strain in his legs and the sharp protest in his joints. He ran where he should have paced, breath tearing from him in harsh pulls. Each step felt borrowed. He did not slow when his vision narrowed or when cold bit through his clothes. Stopping was not an option he allowed himself to consider. The descent blurred into effort and motion. Snow flew beneath his boots, branches struck his shoulders, the path barely registered. All that existed was the weight in his arms, and the certainty that if he faltered, something essential would be lost. Not just her life, but whatever fragile balance he had managed to preserve within himself. By the time the cabin came into view, his strength was nearly spent. He forced himself onward, driven by the same resolve that had carried him through winters past, now sharpened by the presence he refused to let slip away. The door closed behind them, cutting off the wind, the mountain, the choice that had brought them there. Inside, the fire awaited rebuilding, and the silence they had left behind would not return unchanged.
Labor began the same night the forest fire drew too close. The air shifted first, thickening with smoke that dulled the stars and pressed low over the trees. Ash drifted down like dark snow, settling on the cabin roof, slipping through every crack. The fire moved with a sound that was not quite wind and not quite thunder, a steady roar that erased distance and direction. There was no choice to be weighed. Silas gathered what little could be carried and wrapped the woman against the cold as another wave of pain folded her inward. The heat from the approaching fire made the night unnatural, the warmth sharp and dry against skin already weakened. Sparks landed on the roof, hissing where they met snow. He did not wait to see if the cabin would hold. He carried her toward the old mine cut into the hillside, a place abandoned long before his time, left behind when the ore ran out and men moved on. The entrance yawned dark and narrow, ringed with stone blackened by years of damp and neglect. Inside, the air was cold and still, heavy with earth. Stone walls absorbed both heat and flame, offering shelter without comfort. The labor deepened. Time lost its shape within the mine, measured only by the tightening and release of her body, by Silas's hands moving where they were needed, by the sound of her breathing echoing off rock. He worked without certainty, guided by fragments of memory and instinct, aware only of the fragile lines separating endurance from failure. Outside, the fire advanced and retreated in waves, its light flickering across the mine entrance like something alive.
Hours passed. Sweat mixed with ash on his skin, his lungs burned from smoke drawn in too deeply. His arms shook from effort he could no longer disguise. Still, he stayed upright, stayed present, refusing to step back from the edge of what was required of him. The stone floor was slick beneath his knees, cold seeping through cloth and bone alike. The child arrived into that narrow space, small and slick with life, lungs filling and emptying in sharp protest against the world. The sound cut through the roar of the fire and the weight of the mine, piercing and undeniable. Against everything Silas had learned to expect, the child lived. The cry held, rising and falling, claiming air and space with unrelenting insistence. The relief came too late for him to receive it fully. Strength left his body in a rush, as if it had been waiting for permission. He collapsed beside them, vision dimming, his chest tightening with smoke and exhaustion. His hands remained curled where they had last been needed, unwilling to release their purpose. The fire burned through the night, consuming what it could reach before moving on, leaving behind a scarred stretch of land and a sky slowly clearing of ash. By morning, the heat had retreated, replaced by the thin, pale light of dawn. Smoke lingered low in the valleys, but the mine held its silence. 3 lives remained within its walls. One breathed shallow and spent. One lay weak but alive, and one cried without pause, refusing the quiet that had claimed so much before. The fire had passed, and what it had failed to take remained, fragile and unyielding against the emptiness it had left behind.
Spring arrived cautiously, as if the land itself hesitated to wake after the long, harsh winter. Snow melted in patches, leaving behind earth still cold and uneven, streams trickling with a slow persistence. The cabin no longer looked as barren. Small signs of life had taken hold. Folded cloth on the table, a cradle placed near the hearth, a few carefully chosen personal items that served no purpose beyond comfort. The air was lighter, carrying faint hints of laughter, of small, unplanned movements that had nothing to do with survival. The woman moved through the cabin with more certainty than before, each step measured, yet no longer burdened by fear. She fed the child, carried the weight of life growing within her, and tended the cabin as though the space had waited for her all along. Her presence changed the rhythm of the home. She was no longer a fugitive from a cruel past. The mountains outside, once imposing and isolating, became a backdrop for tentative calm rather than constant threat. Silas adjusted to the subtle changes as well. He remained quiet, as he always had, but the tension in his movements softened. Tasks that had once been solitary were shared in the quiet of coordinated routine.
His eyes lingered longer on the child, on the small signs of growth around the cabin, on the green shoots pushing through the thawing soil. The weight he carried did not disappear, yet it shifted, no longer consuming him entirely.
Neighbors and strangers began to approach, at first cautiously, drawn by curiosity rather than trust. Some left supplies quietly, some offered tentative assistance, and some just paused, observing the new life forming in the cabin. Gradually, barriers softened. Visitors returned more often, bringing not judgment, but small gestures of connection. The woman and Silas, once isolated by necessity and fear, allowed life to brush against them gently, accepting what could be given without expectation. The child grew quickly, filling the space with noise and movement. Each cry, each tiny step, became a declaration that life persisted beyond loss. The child marked a boundary beyond which the past could not trespass, a living testament to endurance and renewal. The cabin, once a shelter against everything, transformed into a home where memory and presence balanced, and silence no longer felt like a threat. The land itself responded. Soil that had resisted seeds now yielded to tender shoots, grass bent under the weight of new life. Even where the earth seemed harsh and thin, stubborn sprouts emerged, green against the muted browns of winter's retreat. Life became visible in slow, persistent ways. Growth was uneven, fragile, but undeniable, just like the people inhabiting the cabin. Challenges remained. Work did not end, storms still came, and the future was uncertain. But existence had become possible, and possibility was enough. The cabin resonated with the quiet rhythms of living. The sound of water warming on the stove, the crackle of the hearth, the soft weight of a child sleeping, the measured movements of two people learning to occupy the same space without fear. Time stretched differently now. Days and nights passed with subtle changes, with small victories in routine and survival. The land, the home, the child, and the adults became intertwined, each shaping the other in ways that could not be forced or hurried. A rhythm was established, fragile yet enduring, like a pulse beneath the snowmelt and thawing soil. The cabin was no longer a refuge from the world, but a place that fostered life. Laughter began to echo, uneven and soft at first, then more confidently. The woman and Silas moved in quiet coordination, carrying their burdens while allowing room for joy, for growth, for hope. The child learned to walk, tottering across the uneven boards, fingers brushing the furniture, curiosity driving each small step. Every movement was a small triumph, a reclaiming of the world from absence and fear. Outside, the forest and fields held the lingering marks of winter, but the first flowers pushed through, fragile and persistent. Life proved itself where once only survival had been possible. The wind carried a different weight now, warm in the sun and soft against the skin. No longer a threat, but a reminder that change was real. If you have listened to the story until the end, then you understand the quiet in which the strongest feelings take root. Here, life is measured not by grand events, but by the slow persistence of hope, by the careful tending of what is fragile, by the courage to remain. Subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales to follow new, slow, cinematic stories of survival, quiet love, and frontier lives, where people find home even when hope seems almost lost.